The day his wife became director, she handed him divorce papers at the dinner table, in front of her mother, her brother, her colleagues, and her God, and told him he was dead weight, she was done carrying. He accepted them without a word, folded them into his jacket pocket, and walked out into the Charlotte night. What she didn't know, a secret of what none of them knew, was that the building her corner office sat inside belonged to him. The company bearing her family's name had been bankrupt, bleeding, and 18 months from collapse before he quietly saved it, with his own money, his own guarantee, and 14 months of invisible work. The title she had just celebrated required his signature to be legal. She had spent 8 years building a life on a foundation she didn't know he owned. And the moment she handed him those papers, he decided it was time she found out. Here is the question nobody at that dinner thought to ask. What happens when the man you dismissed as beneath you turns out to be the reason everything you have still exists? If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that like button right now. It tells us you want more stories like this one. Subscribe if you're new here, because we drop new narratives every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We want to know who's in the room. Now let me take you all the way back to where this story truly begins. Not at that dinner table, but years before it, in the books of a dying company and the hands of a quiet man who decided to save it anyway. The house on Arsley Road smelled like pot roast and ambition. Paulette Hargrove had been cooking since 2 in the afternoon, which was her way of saying this evening mattered. The good dishes were out, the cream-coloured ones with the gold rim that only appeared at Easter, and at moments the family needed to remember forever. The dining-room table sat 8, and every seat was filled with someone who had been carefully selected to witness Keisha Hargrove's arrival. Elijah sat at the far end. He had worn his navy blazer, the one Keisha had bought him 2 Christmases ago, and that he suspected she now regretted. He had trimmed his beard that morning. He had brought a bottle of sparkling cider because he knew Paulette didn't keep alcohol in the house on principle, and because bringing something was the kind of thing he did without being asked. The bottle sat on the counter, unopened, next to a fruit arrangement nobody had touched. Terence noticed it when he walked past to refill his sweet tea. "Sparkling cider," he said, not to Elijah specifically, but loud enough for the table to catch. Man couldn't even bring real champagne to his wife's celebration dinner. He laughed at his own observation, and 2 of Keisha's colleagues from the firm smiled the careful, non-committal smile of people who understood the room's power structure and had no interest in disrupting it. Elijah did not look up from his plate. Paulette set a second basket of rolls on the table and smoothed her dress with both hands. "I told Keisha that Camry is going to need replacing before winter," she said to no one in particular. "I just worry about the impression it makes when she pulls up to client events." She said it the way she said everything. Warm, almost concerned, the cruelty wearing the costume of good intentions. Keisha sat at the head of the table. She had changed after work into a cream blouse and tailored trousers, and she looked exactly like what she believed herself to be, a woman who had earned something. She had smiled at Elijah when he arrived, but it was the smile you give someone you've already decided about. It landed somewhere just past him. The dinner moved the way those dinners always moved in that house. Compliments to the cook. Talk about the firm's growth projections. One of the colleagues mentioned a piece in the Charlotte Observer about minority-owned financial firms making ground in the southeast, and everyone at the table nodded with the particular pride of people who believed they were the subject of that story. Elijah ate. He was working through his second helping of green beans when Keisha reached under her chair, The envelope was standard legal size, cream-colored, thick. She set it on the table beside his plate without drama, without preamble, without even lowering her voice. "I've had those prepared for about 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to wait until I knew for certain the promotion was official. Now it is." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people letting a moment breathe. The jagged quiet of people calculating what their face should be doing. Elijah looked at the envelope. He did not touch it immediately. He read his name on the front, Elijah Mast Hargrove, printed in the clean, indifferent font of a legal document service, and he understood in a single breath exactly what it was, and exactly what was happening, and exactly why this room had been filled with witnesses. He picked it up. He opened it. He read the first page with the same expression he used when he reviewed a student's work. Steady, patient, taking in information. "You deserve someone who's operating at the same level," Keisha said. She had prepared this sentence. "I've grown. The company has grown. I need my life to reflect that." Terence looked at his plate, but the corner of his mouth moved upward. Paulette pressed her lips together in an expression she would later describe to her sister as reluctant but necessary. Elijah folded the papers. He looked at Keisha for a long moment, not with anger, not with devastation, not with the performed stoicism of a man holding himself together. He looked at her the way he looked at an equation whose answer he had already worked out, checking his work one final time before closing the notebook. "You want me gone tonight or in the morning?" he asked. The table's silence changed quality entirely. Keisha lifted her chin. "Tonight would be better." "All right," he said. He pushed back from the table. He folded the envelope once more and slid it into the inside pocket of his navy blazer with the same unhurried motion he used for everything. He picked up his plate and carried it to the kitchen, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who cleaned up after himself even on his way out the door. It was in the kitchen that he saw Gerald through the window. Keisha's father was walking up the front path, running late the way he always ran late, hat in his hand. But Gerald Hargrove stopped walking when he saw Elijah through the glass. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly and not grief exactly, but something that sat between those two things like a man watching a door closed that he knew he should have opened years ago. Elijah held his gaze. And Gerald, 66 years old, former president of a financial firm, a man who had never in his adult life been the first to look away from anything, looked down at the concrete path beneath his feet. Elijah set his plate in the sink. He retrieved his jacket from the coat closet. He picked up his keys from the hook beside the door, where he had hung them every evening for 6 years. He walked through the living room, past the table, past the good dishes and the uneaten fruit arrangement, and the bottle of sparkling cider he had brought because bringing something was what he did. Nobody stopped him. He opened the front door. The November air in Charlotte carried the smell of someone's wood fire 2 houses down, and the street was quiet and amber-lit, and his 2014 Camry sat exactly where he had parked it. He heard the conversation resume behind him before he reached the bottom step. He did not look back. And now, before we go any further, before the board meetings and the legal notices, and the day everything Keisha Hargrove had built on borrowed ground began to fall, you need to understand who Elijah Mast Hargrove actually was. Because the man who walked out that door was not a man who had been defeated. He was a man who had just made a decision. And those are 2 entirely different things. To understand Elijah Mast Hargrove, you have to understand Estelle. Estelle Mast was born in 1941 in a house off Beatty's Ford Road, the fourth daughter of a man who fixed shoes and a woman who made them last. She learned to sew before she learned long division, and by the time she was 19 she had a reputation in the neighborhood for alterations so clean you couldn't find the seam. She saved money the way people save money when they understand its true weight, slowly, deliberately, without complaint. And in 1971, with $22,000 she had stitched together dollar by dollar over a decade, she walked into a partnership with a man named Clifton Hargrove and co-founded what would become Hargrove Mast Financial Group. She never ran the firm from the front. That wasn't her way. She held her 44% stake like a quiet deed to something she trusted would outlast her. She watched Clifton build the client relationships and sign the lobby agreements, and she kept her records in a green ledger she stored in a fireproof box under her bed. When Clifton passed in 1989, she stayed on the board without ceremony, collected her quarterly distributions, and said very little at meetings that didn't require her voice. Elijah was her daughter's son, and he was the one she chose. Not because he was the loudest or the most ambitious, but because he was the most honest. He had grown up watching her count, and the habit had taken root in him like a moral principle. He earned his mathematics degree from Johnson C. Smith University in 2009, started teaching 8th grade at West Charlotte High School the following fall, and settled into the work with the satisfaction of a man who understood that shaping a mind was not a small thing. He drove a sensible car, he graded papers on Sunday evenings with the radio on low. He visited Estelle every Thursday without being asked. She told him once, near the end, that the firm was going to need him. He hadn't known what she meant. He found out 8 years before that Saturday dinner on Arsley Road. Hargrove Mast was dying. Gerald Hargrove had inherited the presidency from his father's era and spent 15 years making decisions that looked confident from the outside and were quietly catastrophic on the inside. By the time the numbers became impossible to ignore, the firm carried $3.1 million in operational debt, had watched its client roster collapse from over 80 accounts to 11, and was running on fumes and the social grace of a name that still meant something in Charlotte's older business community. Gerald had 18 months before the whole structure fell. He made phone calls. Some people offered sympathy. Some offered referrals to restructuring firms that charged more than the firm had. One Sunday morning after service at Greater Dimensions Church, a deacon named Howard pulled Gerald aside and said quietly that Estelle Mast's grandson was the sharpest financial mind he'd ever seen that wasn't in a corner office. He said it like a secret. Gerald listened. He called Elijah on a Tuesday. Elijah said he would look at the books, nothing more. He spent 2 weekends with the records spread across his kitchen table, eating peanut butter crackers and running calculations long into both nights. He found the problems within the first 3 hours of the first Saturday. He spent the rest of the time confirming what he found and mapping what a recovery would require. It was not impossible. It was not even complicated if you had the patience and the capital and the willingness to make unpopular decisions quickly. Elijah had all three. He deployed $190,000 from the inheritance Estelle had left him, money he had touched only once before, to pay off his student loans and had not touched since. He personally guaranteed a $900,000 SBA loan, which meant that if the restructuring failed, the debt was his. His name, his credit, his risk. Gerald's name was nowhere on the guarantee. Over the next 14 months, Elijah rebuilt the firm's asset portfolio from the ground up. He restructured 2 legacy contracts, terminated 3 that were bleeding money, renegotiated the firm's primary service agreements with a precision that impressed every party involved, and rebuilt the client pipeline through a combination of cold outreach and the quiet authority of someone who knew what he was talking about. By the time it was done, the firm had 63 active accounts, 0 operational debt, and a quarterly outlook that Gerald presented to the board as evidence of his own steadiness under pressure. Gerald never corrected that impression to the board, but privately, in a law office on a Wednesday morning in February, he signed over Estelle's 44% founding stake to Elijah. He signed the deed to 830 Moorhead Street. He signed the confidentiality agreement that Elijah's attorney James Whitmore had prepared. Both men kept copies. Neither spoke about it afterward. Gerald told his family that an investor had helped the firm through a rough patch. Nobody asked for a name. 3 years later, at the firm's holiday party, Gerald introduced Elijah to his daughter Keisha in the way you introduce two people you expect to remain strangers. Keisha shook Elijah's hand and commented that the shrimp skewers were better than last year's. She did not ask what he did. She did not ask how he knew her father. She was already moving towards someone more interesting before the handshake was finished. They were married 14 months after that, and on the wedding day, when the reception was winding down and the cake had been cut, and the older relatives had started collecting their coats, Gerald Hargrove found Elijah near the back of the hall and shook his hand one more time. It was not the handshake of a father-in-law welcoming a new son. It was the handshake of a man who owed something he could never repay and knew it, and was hoping the other man would let it go. Elijah shook his hand back and said nothing. The band started up again, and someone called for the newlyweds, and Keisha appeared at Elijah's side looking radiant and untouchable, already turning toward the crowd, already performing the next version of herself. And the years began. The years of a marriage do not collapse all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly, in the small moments that nobody outside the house ever sees. A comment at dinner, a tone in a hallway, an introduction at a party that leaves out just enough to sting. That was how it went for Elijah. Not a single devastating blow, but 1,000 small ones, each landing with the precision of people who had decided what he was worth and saw no reason to revise the estimate. Paulette set the standard, and she set it early. She had a gift for cruelty that wore the costume of concern. She would arrive at their house on Sunday afternoons, unannounced, always unannounced, because announcing herself would have required treating their home as a separate space from her own, and within 20 minutes she would have found something to observe. The Camry needed new tires. The neighborhood was fine, but had Elijah considered that the Ballantine corridor was really where professionals were putting down roots these days? She heard the school board had cut the math department's supplies budget again. It must be so hard, she would say, working in a system that didn't value its people. She never raised her voice, she never had to. Terence was less elegant about it, but he was consistent. At the 4th of July cookout in the Hargroves' backyard, year 2 of the marriage, Terence had introduced Elijah to his college friends as Keisha's husband. He teaches middle school. The pause before middle school did more work than any insult could. At the firm's anniversary dinner the following spring, Terence had made a joke about Elijah grading papers while the adults talked business, and the table had laughed in that careful way that meant everyone heard it, and nobody wanted to own their reaction. Elijah had smiled. He was good at smiling at things that didn't deserve a smile. He had learned that from Estelle, who had survived decades of being underestimated by men with nicer offices. The shift in Keisha was slower, and it was sadder because there had been something real at the beginning. In the first 2 years, she had reached for his hand at dinners. She had told a colleague once that her husband was the smartest person she knew. She had laughed at his jokes with her whole face, the unperformed laugh that she didn't use in public. But ambition has a way of rearranging a person's interior furniture, and as Keisha climbed at Hargrove Mast, senior analyst, then associate director, then the clear trajectory towards something larger. She began seeing her life as a presentation. And Elijah did not fit the presentation. She stopped inviting him to firm events by year 4. She stopped correcting her mother by year 5. The first time Paulette made the Camry remark in front of Elijah and Keisha said nothing, he felt it more than anything Paulette had actually said. Silence from a spouse lands differently. It is its own kind of verdict. Then came Terence and the consulting contract. Keisha brought it to Elijah over dinner one evening, framed as a family opportunity. Terence had experience in relationship management, she said. He understood the firm's culture. The position was $95,000 annually, funded through a director's discretionary budget that Keisha was managing in her associate director capacity. Elijah asked 2 questions. He asked whether Terence had any formal financial services credentials, and Keisha said credentials weren't the only measure of value. He asked whether the contract had gone through standard procurement, and Keisha said that was an internal matter. He did not ask a third question. He watched Terence's business cards appear on the counter a week later. Terence Hargrove, business development consultant, Hargrove Mast Financial Group, and said nothing further. He noticed Derek around the same time. Derek was a senior relationship manager at the firm, polished in the way of someone who had been told since college that he was exceptional. His name started appearing in Keisha's work stories with a frequency that had its own rhythm. Keisha worked late on Tuesdays. Derek's team had a standing late session. Keisha's phone lit up on Saturday mornings with a name Elijah had learned not to look at directly. He had no proof of anything. He had only the particular arithmetic of a man who taught mathematics and understood patterns, and what he saw did not add up to nothing. He said nothing about Derek either. Because 18 months before that dinner on Arsley Road, Estelle had passed. She went quietly, the way she had lived, on a Thursday morning in her own bed, gospel radio playing low in the kitchen. Elijah sat with her for an hour before he called anyone. He held her hand and thought about the green ledger under her bed and everything she had understood about patience and power and the wisdom of knowing when to speak and when to simply wait. The attorneys contacted him within a week. He met with James Whitmore twice over the following months, once to receive the documentation, once to sign the formal transfer paperwork. Both times he told Keisha he had a school board committee meeting. Both times she said all right, without looking up from her laptop. She did not ask what he was doing. She had already decided what kind of man he was, and the man she had decided he was would not be doing anything that required her full attention. The promotion came through on a Wednesday. Elijah heard her on the phone with Paulette that evening, and the conversation lasted 47 minutes, and by the end of it the dinner had been planned. She chose the guest list deliberately, her mother, her brother, 2 colleagues who would carry the story back to the firm. She chose the house on Arsley Road because it was familiar ground, her ground. She chose the dinner table because an audience was part of the point. Keisha Hargrove did not stumble into that moment on Saturday night. She built it. She chose her witnesses, set her stage, and decided that the occasion of her own ascension was the appropriate moment to cut loose the one weight she believed she had been carrying. She had no idea what was holding her up. The morning after Elijah walked out of that house, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line over West Charlotte, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not called in over a year. James Whitmore answered on the second ring. Pacing begins to accelerate from this chapter forward. The slow burn is over. James Whitmore's office occupied the 9th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, and it looked exactly like what it was. the workspace of a man who had spent 30 years being right about things that mattered. The shelves were organized without being decorated. The desk was clear except for a single manila folder. The window behind Whitmore framed a clean slice of the Charlotte skyline, and somewhere in that skyline, about 6 blocks north, stood the building at 830 Moorhead Street. Elijah arrived at 8:55. He had slept in his apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Noda that he had leased the morning after leaving Arsley Road, calling a number he had kept in his phone for exactly this contingency. He had unpacked nothing except his toiletries and his coffee maker. He had graded a set of geometry quizzes at the kitchen table that Sunday evening, red pen moving steadily through the work of 23 eighth graders who had no idea their teacher was sitting at the edge of one of the most consequential decisions of his life. He sat down across from Whitmore and left the coffee untouched. Whitmore opened the folder. He did not begin with pleasantries because Elijah had never required them, and Whitmore was not a man who offered what wasn't needed. He began with the equity. 44% of Hargrove Mast Financial Group, he said, held under the entity designation Delaney Mast Holdings, fully transferred and documented in a series of instruments executed 8 years prior and supplemented by the trust conveyance following Estelle Mast's passing 18 months ago. Every filing was current, every signature was valid. The documentation, he said, was airtight in the way that only paperwork prepared by someone who expected it to eventually matter could be. Elijah nodded once. He already knew this. Then Whitmore moved to the property. The deed to 830 Moorhead Street, the building that housed Hargrove Mast's headquarters, the building where Keisha's name appeared on a placard outside a corner office on the 11th floor, was recorded in Elijah's name. Assessed value $4.3 million. The current occupancy arrangement operated under a lease agreement that Whitmore's firm had structured with a renewal clause requiring written consent from the property owner. The last renewal had been executed 3 years prior. The next renewal window opened in 45 days. Elijah looked at the skyline. Then he asked his question. He asked whether Keisha's appointment to the Director of Development position had been processed through the Mast-side ratification protocol embedded in the original 1971 partnership agreement between Estelle Mast and Clifton Hargrove. Whitmore paused for exactly 1 beat. No, he said, it had not. The clause required that any senior executive appointment at the partner level be ratified by both founding family lines. The Hargrove side had always ratified appointments internally because for decades the Mast side had simply not been present. When Estelle was alive, she had attended board meetings twice a year and signed what was placed in front of her without friction. Nobody on the current board knew the clause existed because nobody on the current board had read the original agreement in full. It was, Whitmore said carefully, a structural oversight of remarkable consequence. Elijah let that sit in the room for a moment. He asked about the SBA loan, the $900,000 guarantee he had signed his name to 8 years ago, when Hargrove Mast was 18 months from collapse and Gerald Hargrove had no other options, and Elijah was a 29-year-old schoolteacher who had looked at the numbers and decided they were solvable. Whitmore confirmed what Elijah already suspected. The loan had been fully retired 14 months prior. Every dollar repaid. Elijah owed nothing. He was exposed to nothing. He had taken on the full risk of rescuing a firm that bore another family's name, carried that risk for years while the same family made jokes about his car, and had been paid back in full without anyone who benefited from the rescue ever acknowledging that it had happened. He owed nothing. He owned everything. The silence in the office had a different quality now. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of a man who had just confirmed, for the final time, what he already knew and was deciding what to do with it. Elijah looked away from the window and back at Whitmore. "How long would it take?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a calculation being spoken aloud. Whitmore's answer was precise: 30 days for the full legal mechanism to achieve effect. The board notification could go out this week. The ratification challenge would trigger an automatic review of all recent executive appointments. The property lease notice could follow immediately after, or simultaneously, Elijah's choice. The entire structure, Whitmore said, had been built by people who assumed the mast side would remain silent forever. It had not been built to withstand a mast who decided to speak. Elijah reached across the desk. Whitmore produced the authorization documents. 2 pages, clean and precise, transferring operational direction of Delaney Mast Holdings from passive to active standing. Elijah read both pages fully, the way he read everything without rushing. Then he picked up the pen Whitmore had placed beside the folder and signed his name in the steady, unhurried hand of a man who had already done the math. Whitmore collected the pages and said one more thing. He asked Elijah what he wanted the outcome to look like. Elijah stood, straightened his jacket, and told him. Elijah told Whitmore he wanted it done correctly, not quickly, not painfully, correctly. He wanted every step grounded in legitimate legal process, every action defensible on its own terms, every document clean enough to survive any scrutiny from any direction. He was not interested in spectacle, he was interested in precision. The distinction mattered to him the way it had always mattered, the way the difference between a correct answer and a careless one mattered in mathematics. You could get close and still be wrong. Elijah did not do close. They spent the rest of that Monday morning mapping the sequence. First, the board notification. Whitmore's firm would send a formal shareholder disclosure to Hargrove Mast's board of directors under the entity name Delaney Mast Holdings, establishing the 44% equity position and formally notifying the board of the mast side ratification clause embedded in the original 1971 partnership agreement. No personal names, no narrative, just entity standing, legal documentation, and a formal request for acknowledgement. The notice would force the board's general counsel to open the original agreement and read what nobody had read in decades. Second, the property. Once the ratification issue triggered its inevitable internal review, and it would trigger a review, Whitmore said, because no competent general counsel could receive that notice and sit still, Elijah would serve formal notice on the building lease. 30 days written notice that Delaney Mast Holdings, as owner of the property at 830 Moorhead Street, would not be renewing the current occupancy arrangement under existing terms. The board could negotiate a new lease. They could begin looking for alternative space. Either way, the decision was Elijah's. Third, as a consequence of the first, the directorship audit. When the ratification clause review opened, every recent executive appointment would come under examination. Keisha's directorship would be the most visible casualty, but the audit would sweep everything, including the discretionary budget expenditures that had funded Terrence's $95,000 consulting contract. That contract had never gone through standard procurement. It had been authorized by a director whose appointment was now procedurally void. The paperwork would not survive contact with a proper review. Elijah had one condition, and he stated it plainly. Nothing moved until the divorce filing was formally received and logged by Whitmore's office. He would not initiate a single step while it could be characterized as retaliation. He was not interested in being the man who struck first. He was interested in being the man who responded lawfully to a legal action that had already been filed against him. The sequence had to be unimpeachable. Whitmore checked his records without being asked. The filing, he said, had been received and logged on Tuesday morning at 9:41. It was now Wednesday. The condition had already been met. Elijah nodded. Then he gave Whitmore one additional instruction. He asked him to contact Clarence Webb, not to request anything, not to suggest any course of action, simply to inform him, as a courtesy, that the ownership structure of Hargrove Mast had changed following Estelle Mast's passing, and that Delaney Mast Holdings had assumed active standing. Clarence Webb was 71 years old and had known Estelle since they were children on Beatty's Ford Road. He had moved $18 million in pension fund assets to Hargrove Mast 8 years ago because Estelle's name was still on the founding documents, and he trusted that legacy. What Webb chose to do with the information Whitmore provided was entirely his own business. Elijah simply felt he deserved to know. Whitmore wrote it down and said he would make the call that afternoon. That evening, from his apartment in Noda, Elijah called Gerald. The phone rang 3 times. Gerald answered with silence. Not hello, just the sound of a man who had been waiting for this call and had nothing prepared for it. Elijah spoke for approximately 30 seconds. He said that he hoped Gerald was well. He said that Whitmore's firm would be in contact with the board shortly, and that he thought it was right for Gerald to hear that from him directly, rather than from a legal notice. He said he bore Gerald no anger. Then he said goodbye and ended the call. Gerald said nothing during the entire 30 seconds. Elijah set his phone on the kitchen counter and made himself a cup of tea. He graded the rest of his geometry quizzes that evening. His 8th graders were working through the properties of parallel lines, the way 2 lines could run alongside each other for an infinite distance and never intersect, governed entirely by the angles at which a 3rd line crossed them. He marked each paper carefully, noting where students had gotten the logic right and where they had made the kind of small errors that seemed harmless until they compounded into something that couldn't be corrected without going back to the beginning. He was back in his classroom by 7:15 on Monday morning. He taught 3 periods before lunch. After school, he stayed an extra 40 minutes to help a student named Marcus who was struggling with the concept of supplementary angles, the idea that 2 separate things could each be incomplete on their own and still together add up to something whole. At 4:47 on Thursday afternoon, the General Counsel for Hargrove Mast Financial Group opened an email from the law offices of Whitmore and Associates. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he picked up his phone and began making calls, and the first person he tried to reach was the board chair, and the second person he tried to reach was a records archivist who could pull the original 1971 partnership agreement from storage, and by the time he reached the 3rd call, it was already after 5 o'clock, and the Charlotte sky outside his office window had gone the deep, bruised purple of a late autumn evening. By Friday morning, Keisha Hargrove's phone was ringing before she finished her first cup of coffee. The call came at 8:43 Friday morning. Keisha had been at her desk for less than 20 minutes, still in the warm glow of her first week as director, when the board chair's assistant called and asked if she could come up. The phrasing was polite, the tone was not. She took the elevator to the 14th floor expecting a formality. A welcome, perhaps. A framing conversation about her first 90 days. She had already drafted talking points in her head on the ride up because Keisha was always prepared, always performing, always one step ahead of the room she was walking into. She was not prepared for this room. The board chair, Raymond Osey, sat at the head of the conference table with his hands folded. The general counsel, a meticulous woman named Patricia Vance, sat to his left with a document open in front of her. Two board members Keisha recognized from quarterly meetings sat across from the empty chair. Nobody was smiling. Nobody offered coffee. A single page sat in the center of the table. Arsley asked Keisha to sit down and told her they had received a shareholder disclosure notice the previous afternoon from an entity called Delaney Mast Holdings. He slid the page toward her. Keisha looked at the name and felt nothing. She had never heard it before. She said so. Patricia Vance told her the entity held 44% founding equity in Hargrove Mast Financial Group, transferred and documented with full legal standing. She told her the entity had formally invoked a ratification clause embedded in the original 1971 partnership agreement between Estelle Mast and Clifton Hargrove. She told her that clause required mast-side approval for all senior executive appointments at partner level. She told her that Keisha's directorship had not gone through that process. Nobody knew to ask, she said. The directorship was procedurally void pending review. The silence that followed was not the silence of people waiting for a response. It was the silence of people who had already made a determination and were delivering it as carefully as they could. Keisha drove to her father's house. She called him 4 times on the way. He did not answer. She pulled into his driveway on a street in Dilworth where the oak trees were turning, and the neighbors all knew each other by name, and she rang the doorbell with the particular urgency of a woman whose world had just cracked open beneath her feet. Gerald opened the door. He looked at her face and said, "I'm sorry, baby," before she could say a word. She pushed past him. He told her everything in his living room, standing, because she would not sit down, and he could not look at her while he sat. He told her about the debt. He told her about the phone calls that went unanswered. He told her about the deacon at church who had mentioned a young man with a mathematics degree and a gift for numbers. He told her about the 14 months of restructuring, the SBA loan, the equity transfer, the deed to 830 Moorhead, the confidentiality agreement. He told her he had never thought Elijah would use it. He said this 3 times, as if repetition changed what it meant. Keisha stared at him and said nothing. Then she got back in her car. She called Elijah once, and the call went to voicemail. Twice, and the same. A 3rd time, and she waited through the full recording before she spoke. What she said into that voicemail was the kind of thing that gets said in the worst moments of a person's life. Loud, unfiltered, furious, a woman who had spent 8 years performing composure finally running out of room for it. The words came out jagged and cutting and completely honest, and every one of them was recorded. Elijah listened to the voicemail once that evening. Then he set the phone face down and made dinner. Terence spent the weekend making phone calls he had no business making. He called 2 board members he had met at firm events and spoke to them in the authoritative tone he reserved for situations that required him to appear more significant than he was. He suggested the notice was spurious. He suggested the entity's standing was unclear. He suggested that as someone with direct knowledge of the firm's leadership structure, he was prepared to speak to the validity of his sister's appointment. Neither board member called him back. On Monday, a secondary notice arrived in the General Counsel's email from Whitmore and Associates. It advised the board that during the directorship review process, all executive discretionary expenditures approved under the void appointment would be subject to audit. This included specifically non-tendered consulting contracts authorized in the previous 90 days. Terence's name did not appear in the notice. His contract number did. Keisha retained a personal attorney by Tuesday afternoon. His name was Franklin Bryce, and he had 20 years of corporate law experience, and he asked her to give him 48 hours to review the original agreement before she made any further statements or decisions. He called her back Thursday morning. There was a long pause before he spoke. He told her the ratification clause was valid, clearly written, and had never been amended. He told her the equity transfer was properly executed and fully documented. He told her the entity had standing that was, in his professional assessment, beyond challenge. He said the words slowly and carefully, the way lawyers speak when they are telling a client something the client will not want to hear more than once. Then he said, "Whoever this is, they did everything right." Keisha held the phone against her ear long after the call ended. The second notices were already on their way, and they were not about paperwork. The second notice arrived Monday morning at 9:02. The board's general counsel opened it, read it once, and called an emergency session for 11 o'clock. By the time the board assembled, the projections were already on the screen. Delaney Mast Holdings, as property owner of 830 Moorhead Street, would not be renewing the building lease under existing terms, 30 days' notice per contract. Emergency relocation costs were estimated at $2.7 million. The firm's quarterly outlook, already strained by the directorship review, collapsed on contact with that number. 2 junior partners started updating their resumes by the end of the day. The board chair called the relocation estimate a conservative figure. The general counsel said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The firm had been at 830 Moorhead for 22 years. The name was on the building. The history was in those walls. Moving was not just a logistics problem, it was a story, and the story was already getting out. Terence found out about his contract on Tuesday. The voiding notice was formal and brief, 1 paragraph, clean language, effective immediately. His consulting agreement, authorized under a directorship appointment now under review, was terminated pending audit findings. $95,000 a year, gone in a single paragraph. He drove straight to Keisha's apartment. He stood in her living room and told her this was her fault. He said she had pushed Elijah too far, moved too fast, and now both of them were paying for it. Keisha told him that was absurd. The argument escalated, and when Paulette arrived trying to smooth it over, she found 2 of her children standing in opposite corners of the room with nothing left to say to each other that wasn't an accusation. They took it to Paulette's house later that evening. The neighbors on Paulette Street had their windows open. It was that kind of night. And Terence's voice carried. Wednesday brought Clarence Webb. His letter arrived by courier, handwritten on personal stationery, addressed to the board chair at Hargrove Mast Financial Group. It was 4 sentences. It stated that he was withdrawing $18 million in pension fund assets from the firm's management, effective at the close of the business week. It stated that his decision was based on a loss of confidence in the stewardship of the firm's founding legacy. It thanked the board for their years of service. It was signed simply Clarence Webb, the board's largest institutional client. Gone. Someone leaked the letter internally within 48 hours. The full text circulated through the firm's email system by Thursday morning, forwarded in a chain that nobody started officially and nobody stopped. The reporter called Thursday afternoon. A journalist from the Charlotte Business Chronicle reached the firm's communications contact and asked about what she was already calling the Mast ownership situation. She said she had documents. She said she had sources. She asked if the firm wanted to provide comment before publication. The communications contact said she would call back. She never did. Derek submitted his transfer request on Friday, a formal application for reassignment to the Raleigh satellite office, citing professional development opportunities. His manager approved it within an hour. The speed of that approval said everything nobody in the firm wanted to say out loud. Whatever Keisha had believed was growing between them had made its calculations and chosen distance. By Friday evening, Paulette had not attended Thursday Bible study. She had called Sister Lorraine to say she wasn't feeling well. Sister Lorraine had said, of course, "Feel better soon," in the warm, careful tone of a woman who had already heard the story and was being kind about it. The church knew. In Charlotte, when a story starts at the firm and ends in the family, the church is always the third stop. The article published Saturday morning. It ran under the headline, "Hargrove Mast Faces Ownership Crisis as Founding Stake Emerges After Decades." Keisha's name appeared in the second paragraph. The article described the emergence of a previously undisclosed 44% equity position, the invocation of a 1971 partnership clause, and what it called a significant disruption to the firm's leadership structure and operational outlook. The journalist had done her homework. The piece was careful, accurate, and devastating. Elijah read it at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He read it the way he read everything, completely without hurry. When he finished, he folded his phone face down beside his mug and looked out his apartment window at the Nodar street below, where a woman was walking a dog and two kids were racing each other to the corner, and the Saturday morning was going about its business, entirely unbothered. He finished his coffee, he rinsed the mug, he put on his jacket. He went to the farmer's market 3 blocks away and bought sweet potatoes and collard greens because he had been meaning to make his grandmother's recipe all week, and there was no reason now not to. Keisha's attorney called that afternoon. He told her the opposing party's counsel had been in contact. He said the opposing party was prepared to meet once, face-to-face, to discuss resolution. He said they had a location preference. Keisha asked where. Franklin Bryce told her, 830 Moorhead Street. Elijah arrived at 8:50. The lobby of 830 Moorhead Street was quiet at that hour. Marble floors, high ceilings, the low hum of climate control that expensive buildings have when the day hasn't fully started yet. A security desk sat near the entrance, and behind it a young woman named Deja, who had worked the morning shift for 3 years and knew every regular by face. She looked up when the doors opened, and when she saw Elijah, she smiled the way you smile at someone familiar. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Deja," he said. "How's your mother doing?" She told him better, thank you for asking. He told her he was glad to hear it. Then he walked to the seating area near the window, a cluster of chairs arranged around a low table, and he sat down and folded his hands and looked out at Moorhead Street in the morning light. And he waited. He had been in this building hundreds of times. He had walked these floors before they belonged to him and after they belonged to him, and the marble had never cared either way. But this morning he noticed the light, the way you notice things when you know a chapter is ending, the way it came through the glass at an angle and lay flat and golden across the floor. His grandmother's money had helped build. Keisha arrived at 9:04 with Franklin Bryce beside her. She was dressed precisely. The cream blazer, the understated jewelry, the composed expression of a woman who had spent the night deciding she would not let this room take anything else from her. Paulette had insisted on coming. Keisha had told her to stay in the car, and for once Paulette had listened, though the car was parked at the curb, and everyone knew she was there. Keisha walked into the lobby of the building with her name on the masthead, and saw her husband, her almost former husband, sitting in the light as if he owned the place. Because he did. She opened immediately with force. She told him this was manipulation. She told him he had hidden things, ambushed her, waited in silence for years like a trap she hadn't known she was walking into. Her voice was controlled, but the edges of it were sharp, and Franklin Bryce placed a gentle hand on her arm and began steering toward process. Settlement framework, structured resolution, equitable outcome. Elijah waited. He sat with his hands folded and his face still, and he waited until the room had emptied itself of everything it needed to say. Then he looked at Keisha with the calm of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he needed to rehearse nothing, and he began to speak. He started with the numbers. He told her about the $3.1 million in debt, the 11 remaining clients, the 18 months. He told her about 2 weekends at his kitchen table with the firm's books spread out in front of him and peanut butter crackers and the particular kind of focus that only comes when the math is both devastating and solvable. He told her about the $190,000 from Estelle's savings, money his grandmother had assembled dollar by dollar with her hands over a decade as a seamstress. He told her about the $900,000 SBA loan he had signed his own name to, his own credit, his own risk, with nothing to gain publicly and everything to lose personally if it failed. He told her it did not fail. He told her it took 14 months. He told her he rebuilt the client pipeline from 11 accounts to 63. He told her about the morning Gerald Hargrove sat across from James Whitmore and signed over the equity and the deed and the confidentiality agreement, and how afterward Gerald had shaken his hand the way a man shakes the hand of someone he owes a debt he can never fully repay. He told her about the wedding, about Gerald's handshake at the reception. He told her about Paulette's Sunday remarks, about Terence's introductions at cookouts, about the firm events she stopped inviting him to, about the counselling suggestion she laughed off, about the trip he planned that never happened, about 8 years of being the man in the room that nobody thought to ask about. Then he looked at her steadily, and he said it. "You stood in our kitchen and told me I wasn't on your level, Keisha. You said it in front of your mama and your brother and 2 of your colleagues, and then you told me to be gone by evening. But what you didn't know, what your daddy never told you, was that there would be no kitchen, no corner office, no company with your name on it, if I hadn't saved it. I built the floor you've been standing on for 8 years, and you handed me divorce papers on it." Franklin Bryce had stopped writing. His pen rested against the legal pad, and he was looking at Elijah with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about this case. The lobby was completely silent. Keisha did not respond immediately. She looked at the floor, the marble floor, the specific floor Elijah had just named. Then she looked at the walls, then at the ceiling, then at her own reflection in the glass panel beside the security desk. She was looking, it seemed, for something to stand on. There was nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its armor. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. It was barely a question. It was the sound of someone understanding, too late, what they had thrown away. Elijah considered her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and finally, "Because I loved you. And love doesn't keep records, but it does eventually run out of room." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the security desk and he looked at Deja and he said, "Tell her mother he said hello." Then he pushed through the front doors of 830 Moorhead Street and walked out into the Tuesday morning, and the door closed behind him with a sound like something settling into its permanent position. Keisha sat in the lobby of the building that had her family's name on it and her husband's name on the deed. She sat there alone for a very long time. 12 months passed. 12 months is not a long time, but it is long enough for the truth to finish its work. Hargrove Mast Financial Group was restructured in the spring under new leadership. A board-appointed interim president named Wallace Odom, who had no history with the Hargrove family and no interest in inheriting their complications. The firm survived. It relocated to a smaller space on South Boulevard, absorbed the $2.7 million disruption as a line item that would take 3 fiscal years to fully recover from, and began the slow process of rebuilding the institutional confidence that Clarence Webb's 4-sentence letter had shattered in a single afternoon. Keisha's name came off the masthead in February, not dramatically, not publicly. It was removed in the quiet, administrative way that institutions remove things they would prefer not to explain. A website update, a directory revision, a business card reorder. She accepted a position at a regional wealth management firm in Greensboro. Senior associate, not director, not partner. Senior associate, which was a title she would have dismissed 8 years ago as insufficient for someone of her abilities. She drove to Greensboro on Monday mornings and drove back on Friday evenings, and did not speak publicly about Charlotte. Terence was gone by March. He packed what fit in his car and moved to his aunt's house in Memphis, Tennessee, the same aunt he had not visited in 6 years because Memphis did not have the professional cachet of Charlotte, and visiting her had not served any narrative he was interested in performing. The $95,000 consulting income was gone, the business cards were gone, the introductions at firm events were gone. He was a 34-year-old man in his aunt's spare bedroom, and the only people who knew the full story of why were the people back in Charlotte who were no longer taking his calls. Gerald retired that same month. He announced it to the board with a prepared statement about his health and his desire to spend more time with family. Nobody pushed back. Nobody asked questions. The family members who sat on the advisory board, uncles and cousins who had spent years deferring to Gerald's authority, had already extracted their full accounting in the weeks after the story broke, in conversations that took place in living rooms and on phone calls, and at a Sunday dinner at his brother Raymond's house that lasted 4 hours and left Gerald diminished in a way that no boardroom had ever managed. He came to Elijah's foundation launch in October. He sat in the back row. He did not approach the podium. He did not introduce himself to the journalists or the city council representative who attended, or the 23 entrepreneurs who received the first round of Estelle Mast Foundation micro-grants that afternoon. He sat in the back row and watched and left quietly when it was over, and Elijah saw him go and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Paulette returned to Thursday Bible study in April. She walked in on a Thursday morning with her Bible and her good purse, and she took her usual seat, and Sister Lorraine poured her a cup of coffee without being asked. Nothing was said directly. Everything was understood. The women of that Bible study had known each other for decades, and they had watched Paulette's pride build and strain and finally collapse, and they were kind to her in the particular way of women who understand that life has its own systems of accounting and trust them to work without comment. The 830 Moorhead Street building became the headquarters of the Estelle Mast Foundation in July. Elijah had spent 4 months working with a design firm and a non-profit attorney to convert the building's lower 2 floors into program space. Financial literacy classrooms, a small business resource center, a computer lab that stayed open until 9 on weeknights. The upper floors he leased to 3 small firms at below-market rates, specifically to black-owned businesses that had been operating out of home offices and co-working spaces and could not otherwise afford a Moorhead Street address. He kept his own office small, no nameplate on the door, just a desk, a bookshelf, and a framed photograph of Estelle at her sewing machine, taken sometime in the early 1960s before the world knew what she was building. The Harvard Business School case study was published in September. A professor in the Entrepreneurship and Strategy Department had contacted Elijah's attorney in the spring after the Charlotte Business Chronicle story circulated through academic networks. The case study was titled Delaney Mast Holdings, Patient Capital, and the Architecture of Quiet Ownership. It was taught in the fall semester to 200 graduate students who spent 90 minutes examining how a school teacher had identified a distressed asset, deployed capital with discipline, built a legal structure with precision, and waited, patiently, quietly, completely, for the moment when the structure would need to speak for itself. Elijah attended the jazz series at the neighborhood theater on Thursday evenings. He had started going in September, alone, with a glass of water and a program he actually read. The third Thursday of October, a woman sat down in the empty seat beside him. She introduced herself as Camille. She was a pediatric nurse at Atrium Health. She asked if he came often. He said he had started recently. She said she had been coming for 2 years and was surprised she hadn't seen him before. He said he had been working through some things. She said she understood that completely. They talked until the last musician packed up and the venue started dimming its lights. She laughed easily and asked follow-up questions and listened to his answers like they mattered. He walked her to her car. She thanked him for the company. He said the pleasure was genuinely his. He drove home through the Charlotte streets with the windows down and the radio on low, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a man whose life had room in it again. Here is what this story teaches, and it is a lesson worth sitting with. True power is not loud. It does not announce itself at dinner tables or hold up champagne glasses or require an audience. True power is patient. It is precise. It keeps its records and honors its obligations and does not mistake being underestimated for being powerless. Elijah Mast-Hargrove did not become powerful the day he walked out of that house on Arsley Road. He had been powerful for years. He simply decided finally to let it show. The people who dismissed him lost everything they had built on borrowed ground. The man they dismissed built something that will outlast all of them. On a Monday morning in November, Elijah pulled up to 830 Moorhead Street in his 2014 Camry, at the same car, still running well, and he parked in the space closest to the entrance that now had his name on the lease. He walked to the front door. Above it, in clean bronze lettering installed on a Thursday afternoon by a man who had done the work with great care, were the words "The Estelle Mast Foundation." He stood there for a moment and looked at it, the way you look at something that has been true for a long time and has finally found its correct form. Then he took out his key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were Elijah, and you had known the truth for years, and you had the power to act the entire time, what would you have done? Would you have waited as long as he did? Or would you have moved sooner? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where you stand. If this story moved you the way it moved me in the telling, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach the people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do it today, because we have more stories coming, stories about patience and power, and the people who underestimate both, and you do not want to miss a single one. I will see you in the next video.